Are you all sitting comfortably? Do you want me to begin, Alice, or...? Right. Okay, lovely. Well, thank you to everybody for coming out tonight. It's encouraging most enormously. I did wonder if we could get anybody with the amount of extra events that are going on, but you've come and you've lifted my spirits exponentially. 2 years ago, we had a talk here by a lady called Catherine McInnes, who wrote this book about the widows and mothers of the people who accompanied Scott to the South Pole. And she inspired my interest to look more clearly at Mrs. Oates, her life and Gestingthorpe. But I pay tribute to Catherine. Do go out and buy her book. Which famous charge is this? Right, Light Brigade was down here, Jackie. Which year was it? 1854, 1855 or 1856? Doesn't get an answer. 54 is down. Who was that? 54 down there, Jackie. Yeah. 1854, September. And what happens in March? He is an industrialist, a iron founder, a metal worker, an engineer. He's a man on the make. He's a man on the rise. And he starts a business when he's 24 years old. By the time he's about 35, he's got 2 live-in servants. And when 1861, he's got a live-in governess, 2 maids and a cook, by which time he is employing 160 people and 30 boys. We've got one or two intellectual people in the audience, Mr. Flower, Mr. Moulton, who have read nearly everything. Can you tell me the Dickens novel in which Mr. Bounderby appears? He's a bit like Caroline's father. He's a man on the make in the north of England. Any answers? Hard Times. And the other one, North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, the novel, the man in question, another man on the make, a northern industrialist, John Thornton. Caroline has a governess to start with, but in time she goes to a school in London. Before we look at that, we can just have a quick look at some of the sort of things her dad was making in the foundry. This is enormous. It's a machine for planing engine bed plates. And my cryptic comment is, after which you all fall about laughing and think how clever I am, is it makes Jeremy Clarkson's tackle look like a dinky toy and him like a little boy in short trousers. This is a northern industrialist making the great equipment of the Industrial Revolution that was going out, to give the expression, across the empire. So Caroline goes off to boarding school in London, and you hope that when she comes back, she isn't too educated, that she's still she hasn't become too snooty. It did happen sometimes, but it brings us to the year 1869, which is a very big year for Gestingthorpe. School in Hampstead, and the reason why it's a big year for Gestingthorpe is that the Walker estate, which used to own pretty much half of Gestingthorpe, it owned Moat Farm, it owned Delvin's Farm, Hill Farm, the Iron Foundry, the brickyard down there, Tucklands and Pound Farm were all sold off, and all that was left of the estate was the hall and about 300 acres. The Walker and 1875 is that some of the new owners did away with the woodlands. 10 acres-ish of punk woods went down there, 10 acres of wiggery wood here disappeared, and a good 10 acres was removed between the church here and wiggery wood, which was Oakley wood. And when I say this, some of you will think, Ashley, you've made a mistake. You mean 1969 to 1975. I don't. I mean 1869 to 1875, roughly 25 to 30 acres of woodland were felled in that time frame. And just to prove it, there's the Ordnance Survey map of 1876. Wiggery has been reduced, Punkswood has disappeared, and the wood, Oakley wood, from down the bottom there, right across to the lower brickyard, which is encapsulated in the name of Pot Kiln Chase, because pots were made there, has almost completely disappeared. 1875, somebody did something physically pretty strenuous and admirable to do with water. Well done! Joe, that deserves a round of applause. That's sort of top scholar of the evening. Caroline, meanwhile, has by now come back to Leeds, and I'm going to just postulate, be a bit imaginative. It's 1875, and I was presented with some interesting documents from Mary Mathias a couple of years ago, which are her piano books. Beethoven Volume 2, and there's all sorts of sonatas in here. What's interesting is that the spine of them has been completely broken. They've been used, and the piano sonatas have been played so often. We can see what she was playing on April the 19th, 1875, and it's particularly significant because cousins, Francis Oates and William Oates. There's a third brother as well. Francis and William have become gentlemen. He is the fifth Westerner to do so, but a few weeks later he catches malaria and dies. By April the 19th, Caroline will have been abreast of the news of her cousin, and she continues to play, and it's just rather touching. We can see which days she was actually playing this music, and we can just speculate what is going on in her mind. 21-year-old lady, got a very well-to-do cousin, William, 13 years her senior, just come back from Africa. That is Francis, or Frank, who dies, and he is commemorated in a lovely stained glass window in the church, which I'll be showing you all later. That's his brother William, who survives and come back to Leeds. This is a picture done for me by Ben Perkins of all the various animals and birds that Francis describes in a huge volume, a natural history volume presented to the Royal Geographical Society and the Science Museum. Anybody know what this creature is? It's now extinct. It begins with Q. Second letter is U.
Sea donk.
Oh, what?
Sea donk.
Who said that?
Well, that's something for a
Yeah, a quagga. Well done, Chris. Yeah, it's a quagga. And they went extinct. All the other species on here, Oates writes about, and one of them was named after him until it was found that it wasn't actually an individual species. Here he is. In a minute, he'll turn up. We've gone forward three. Right, well, there he was, it'll come up in a minute, looking at the Victoria Falls just before he dies. There's a bit of a lapse in technology. Right, you've just glimpsed Caroline and William. They become engaged, they marry, they clearly very well to do. He has assets of about £120,000. That's what he leaves when he dies. A huge fortune in those times. Where do they marry? Mindful that they were both to come here and invest hugely in this church. Leeds Cathedral, York Minster, none of them. At the Unitarian Chapel in Leeds. For generations, there have been nonconformists at a time when there was a significant difference between church and chapel. They were chapel people, but as they began to prosper, they moved away from their roots. I just say that because it's sort of slightly interesting. Within a year, Caroline is pregnant and gives birth to her first daughter, Lillian. And you might wonder where she goes to give birth to her first daughter. Presumably back to Leeds. to be with her mother. She doesn't. She goes to Dusseldorf in Germany. What on earth does she go there for? Why didn't she go with her mother? Have they fallen out? Is there some friction? Is there some sort of Archers-type scandal? Very sadly, nothing like that at all. It's a very sobering reason. Caroline's mother died when Caroline was 4.5. Well, why doesn't she go to her grandmother? Most grandmothers dote on having grandchildren with them, especially at such a critical point. She can't go to her grandmother either, because her grandmother died at the age of 29, when Caroline's mother was just 2 months old. Caroline goes on to have 4 children, and she and her sisters are the first generation for 3 generations to live beyond the age of 30. We've got a brass plaque up there to Captain Oates. There really needs to be another one next to it, to that legion of women who died giving birth or having gynecological problems, and commemorating them as well. Well, Lawrence comes along in 1880. This rather effeminate-looking child goes on to become the great polar explorer. I feel a bit sorry for him dressed up like that. And he's born March the 17th, 1880, commemorated on the plaque there. What great sporting event, Mr. Moulton. I'm not going to pick on you again, but you should know this. You're the Gestingthorpe Cricket Club groundsman, that's a hint if ever there was one. Happens between September the 6th and 8th, 1880. I'll take the words out of your mouth. You're bubbling to say the first test match. Well done, Chris. Is Lawrence, yes, we can give him a card as well. Is Lawrence a strong and robust child? No, he's weak, he's sickly, he suffers from probably pneumonia, and when he's 4 years old, his mother is so concerned about him, bearing in mind that she loses a brother when he was 7, and she has a younger sibling who died, that they take him to South Africa to get away from the smogs and fogs of London. She makes a really difficult choice, and I'm not quite certain why she has to make it. Does she and her husband take Lawrence to South Africa with all the other children, or do they leave the other children behind? Very tough decision, because the other children are so young. The first year, she goes with William and Lawrence, and they leave the other 3 children, roughly aged 2 and 4 and 5 or 6, behind. The following year, they take Lawrence to South Africa again. This time, just her husband takes him. The family, what does that look like? I filched it off the internet. Is it remotely in focus? Oh, encourage me to filch more off the internet. Save me a Joe and Jenny. For some years, the family live a slightly rootless, peripatetic sort of existence. They live in a number of hired houses. They travel about to various holiday resorts, finally able to put their roots down a bit more solidly in this house, which is in Richmond, Upper Richmond Road in London, and they stay there for about 5 years until they eventually move to Gestingthorpe. Gilbert and Sullivan produced one of their more famous operettas in 1885. We've got a choice of about 13, I think. Sorry, Joe. Mikado. Who said that? Card for Suzanne, Jackie. Mikado. And one can well imagine Mr. and Mrs. Oates living here in their very, very comfortable, affluent situation, going to see the Mikado and enjoying it in London. Lawrence's health and also his father's health begins to dictate that they need to move out to the countryside. And I suspect also that they feel they would like to do something a bit more involved, a bit more committed, a bit more to do with being creative and professional and playing a role in society. In 1891, Gestingthorpe Hall comes onto the market and they buy it and move down here. That's just a reminder of Lawrence and his dad on the boat to South Africa. A picture of the 4 children, probably at about the time they did move to Gestingthorpe. Here is Gestingthorpe Hall as it is today. What was Gestingthorpe like when they arrived? Population of 620. Over the next 10 years, it's going to drop by 145. Rural life is in decline. There are old people about who remember the stocks being out here on Church Green, where some of your cars have parked, being used within living memory, and the village poorhouses, now known as the barracks, standing there as well. I won't keep asking questions because we're going to run out of cards, but who made their very first appearance in the Strand magazine in 1891? Who said Sherlock Holmes? Well done, right at the back, Sherlock Holmes, Jackie. And Thomas Hardy produced his penultimate novel. Don't say Mayor of Casterbridge. Don't. Test of the D'Urbervilles down here, Jackie. This is Gestingthorpe Hall as it is today. What was Gestingthorpe like when they moved to it? A rural, I won't say impoverished, but a rural village where clearly there were no modern amenities and any form of improvement hadn't begun. That's the street going up to the Pheasant. Here's the post office with the postmaster, Mr. Rayner. The blacksmith, which is just wonderful. One of the people who welcomed you in, Peter Nice, is the grandson or great-grandson of the people who were running the blacksmith's forge then, and his brother still does, which is equally wonderful. And brickyard up towards the Pheasant, another one down there near Popkiln Chase, together with a pop kiln. This is a super photograph. This is the wheelwrights, where Penny and Steve live today, run by the Pannell family, who we'll be mentioning later. A school just down there, opened in 1855, following, and then with the Education Act of 1870, all the village children now going, some of them being dragged out by the farmers to help weed the crops, some of them being very dilatory in returning after harvest because they're gleaning. Gestingthorpe is a bit unusual. In addition to 2 brickyards and a pottery, we've also got an iron foundry, cunningly now remembered in the crossroads known as Foundry Corner, where you go up to Little Yeldham. Here is the picture of the foundry, run by the Downs family, who are making ploughs and pig troughs, railings, and repairing all sorts of farm implements, but particularly known for the ploughs. There were roughly 100 heavy horses in Gestingthorpe at the time. There'd have been roughly 100 farm workers, roughly 100 heavy horses for the Nice family to shoe, to put frost nails on, and to look after. And of course, every crumb of soil that was moved was done then by the power of the horses. And around us, it was mixed agriculture. Today we would call it organic farming. In those days, it was just farming as it was. Almost every farm would have had pigs and cattle together with their horses. Many of them would have had sheep as well. And so that's the Gestingthorpe they moved to. This is roughly the hall as it was when they arrive. Within a very short period of time, their love of building and of architecture and of embracing the arts and crafts movement encapsulated by William Morris encourages them to put the pediment on, and also a family crest which is there. The Latin, have we got any Latin scholars here? Have we? right, that's all right. Sua dextra seque, which I'm told by Michael Sharp, Michael and Elaine very kindly gave a lot of time up to show me round the hall on Monday. I'm told by Michael it means to everyone my right hand, a form of greeting on the outside of the hall to those who came in. There it is, and the great baton above it. In addition to building the pediment, they extend the hall, they renovate it, they add every possible William Morris arts and crafts fine bit of architectural detail into the building they can, and they extend it from roughly here to here. This other bit's going to come on a bit later, and there we can see the crest that William Oates has put into the brickwork, and later, that's a fine bit of brickwork as well, isn't it? It's superb. They also build, together with outhouses, the stable block, and making their appearance in the village and wanting to set off on the right foot, and I'm paraphrasing a little, give this wonderful brass lectern. It's a significantly heavy thing. It's not that unusual, but I can very well imagine that if they go back to Yorkshire and they tell Caroline's dad they're going to give brass lectern to the church, he will say, and I can't do a Yorkshire accent, "Here, lass, make the thing strong and heavy enough." And there was a time when the church wardens used to chain this to the bench down there. You've got to be pretty mega strong to carry that out, and I'm glad to see it hasn't got a chain on it now. So another one of Caroline's dad's wonderful influence. Let's just imagine that Caroline and William are being shown around the church by the most devoted clergyman at the time, whose name was Crowder Tom Bromwich. First of all, he shows them the tower. In those days, it was crumbling at the top, the wood was rotting there was problems with it, but it is still an outstandingly good tower, and perhaps with just a touch of pride, he says, so much more impressive than this church, which is, it begins with L, Liston, so much better than, where's the next one got to? This church, which is Wycombe St Paul's, a card to Charleston, and Castle Hedingham, which, by comparison with Gestingthorpe, oh God, have you got some Castle Hedingham people here? Looks absolutely fantastic. So, having looked at the tower, he shows them the superb brick diapering built into the tower, and then he brings them round. He shows them the brick pinnacles, and they are really impressive. And then he says, just look up, Mr. and Mrs. Oates. Just beneath the brick pinnacles, there is something quite unusual about Gestingthorpe Church Tower. There is a pattern of nat flints. If you give the photograph, they look chalky, but actually it is flints, and on a sunny day in September, they shine and glow. And maybe, how many of you here have ever seen these shiny flints? Because it's a really lovely little gem of this church. And when they built the tower, they took a lot of effort to put that pattern of nat flints in, together with the blind arcade, which is an architectural expression I learnt about 45 minutes ago. Maybe Mr. and Mrs. Oates say, are there any other local churches with brick towers that have flints with them? And that's the close-up. And he replies, yes, there is one near Sudbury. Anyone know where this church is? Begins with C, it's Chiltern. Yeah, and I would love to know more about brick towers with flints at the top, because it's an interesting feature. This is the only other one I'm aware of, but I'm always keen to be educated and learn more. And having looked at the brick tower, they come to the porch, notice this huge buttress, which is down there, there's a particular reason for that, and they come into the church and they look up and they behold the glory of Gestingthorpe Church. It really is this stunning double hammer beam roof that was so kindly photographed for me by Charles Williams. And as you look at it, the point about the double hammer beam roof, it means you're just looking up and up and up as if into the heavens. There is this wonderful moulding on the beams, and then underneath it there are decorated bosses. And perhaps Mr. and Mrs. Oates asked them about it, and Reverend Bromwich has become very knowledgeable, and he says, when the diagram comes back, yes, well, of course, Gestingthorpe is a pendant double hammer beam roof. Now, just to explain what that means, most double hammer beam roofs, the post that comes down fits into a mortise there. And that means you can't have any decoration underneath. At Gestingthorpe, the beam comes down, but the cross beam goes in the mortise there, and the whole weight, and it's quite extraordinary, is held by 2 wooden pegs. But it means that you can have the decorated boss. And there are other ones at Tostock, Weatherden, Cotton, and Castle Headingham. And we're just going to look at a few bosses. That's a boss from Gestingthorpe, just stunning decoration. And the next one is Gestingthorpe. That is actually, yeah, and this one is Bulmer, because we believe that the architect, the carpenter, Thomas Loveday, did Bulmer as well as Gestingthorpe. He did some of St John's College, Cambridge, in Cambridge, it's part of the chapel there, and possibly one of the guild halls in Levenham. And it's here that we have a real dilemma, because English heritage say that the double hammer beam roof was constructed in 1489. And they say that there's an inscription that's their example, that there's an inscription that says that. I have a pair of binoculars here, and I would love, because we've got some real timber experts, we've got Peter Owen, we've got Alistair, church restorer, we've got Richard Marshall. I would love you in the interval to see if you can see any inscription saying 1489, because I very much question, I can be completely wrong, whether English heritage got it right, and whether in fact the roof wasn't contemporary with the tower, because everything sort of points in that way and dates to the 1520s. So I invite people to help me research this and try to work out why English heritage have come up with this date. This is how the church was in 1891, when Reverend Bromwich is showing the Oates family around it. Notice the pulpits over there, and the church is now in a state of semi-dereliction and ruin. 3 years later, it is so unsafe, it is condemned and you can't use it. The arcade is bending out. They've had to brick up all above me here to try to keep the building standing, and there are great buttresses on the outside to try to keep it standing. And we can imagine, as Mr. and Mrs. Oates stand here and Reverend Bromwich is talking to them, we can imagine them saying something along the lines of, "It's such a responsibility for me to think that this church, after 800 years, might have to be closed for good, to think that it might fall down. Oh, the pressure's on me. I struggle so much to know how we can find the funds to do this." And you can then imagine a significant dig in the elbow between Mr. and Mrs. Oates, and Mrs. Oates to Mr. Oates. It is actually a complete community fundraising effort. They put up £200. They need about £1,000 to do the job. It starts in 1894 in the spring, and as you can see, the church is completely gutted. They dismantle the double hammer beam roof. They have to put new rafters and things in. As we look at the pictures, we can see that I stand to be corrected. I think it is wooden scaffolding. I think it's wooden scaffolding tied together with rope. That's the south aisle there. They've had to completely take the roof off there and put it back again. And it is a very significant job of church restoration. The outside with that huge buttress that they've put on to try and keep the church standing for as long as they can. One thing which the picture didn't quite show is that instead of looking up to the wonderful roof, there are huge, great beams going across the middle. They've put tie beams in to try to keep the building standing. When Mr. and Mrs. Oates walk in here with Mr. Bromwich, he sighs piteously and he looks up at that wall and he says, "Hate to mention it, it's such a struggle for me, but that wall, I'm told by the architect, is now 18 inches out of true." And on some of the pictures, you can actually see the wall bending or twisting, and you can see the parts of the roof clearly are well out of straight. Here, it looks like it is a little tilting over in the wrong direction. And so, this is the church as it is today. Same photograph from the same spot. Pulpits come over here. The bricks have been taken out from the top of the arch. They're no longer needed. The church is structurally sound. The next picture shows us the view as it was from the font, and this is as it is now. The great big support beam they'd put there has been moved away, and the stairs which used to go up to the roof loft have been moved out, making that much lighter and clearer too. There is the great big beam that was put across. There's the old photograph with the box pews, wonderful things where the squire could sit with a little fire to keep his feet warm, have a little snooze if he wanted while the sermon went on. And that's the same picture today with the organ there, which was built later, and the oil lamps, which I suppose all local churches had, and the outside with that buttress, which becomes the extension to take the harmonium and then the organ. Just so that nobody thinks Gestingthorpe is special, nearly every local church underwent some sort of similar restoration in Victoria times. There was a squire or a parson or somebody with funds that enabled the churches to be done up. Bulmer went through something very similar. Anyone like to tell me where this is? It's Foxearth, restored by the incumbent at the time, Reverend Foster, in the most wonderful sort of Anglo-Roman way with lots of mosaics and things. But that's just to make sure that the Oates donations and what Gestingthorpe did isn't seen out of perspective. To raise the rest of the money, Mrs. Oates and others have a grand bazaar. They have it at Gestingthorpe Hall on the 11th and 12th of June 1895, and it is opened by the Countess of Warwick. Anybody know anything about the Countess of Warwick? She lived at somewhere called Eastern Lodge, which is near Dunmow.
Daisy. She was the mistress of the...
Absolutely. Yeah, you get a card for that. Let's just say Mick Jagger would struggle to keep up with her, and Carol Vorderman would be well out of her depth. If you know what Carol Vorderman's up to. She was the mistress of the Prince of Wales, amongst others, but she came here and she opened the bazaar, and we read, and it is written in the most enchanting sort of way, that the church was in a ruinous condition. A collapse was imminent. Now, after restoration at a cost of £1,400, a beautiful and substantial structure, it has come into the hearts of divers honourable wives and maidens, with grievous toil and haply much pricking of their fair fingers, to fashion and prepare many things of beauty. Wherefore let all come with pouches full of silver and gold, to purchase bargains right merrily of these good dames and maidens, and help us raise £200 so we can clear the debt. What a wonderful piece of upper-class twaddle. And the various stallholders, the whole village is represented, and we move on. It's under the patronage of the great and good, the wealthy and the county set of the area, the Hyde Parkers, the Madgenders, the Raymonds, the Burkes from Bulmer. Anybody who is anybody has been asked to contribute. There's a shooting gallery, photographs, Helster Town Band, and also stabling for 70 horses at the iron foundry. A really lovely, interesting detail that we tend to forget. They didn't need a car park, they needed stabling for the horses. In the meantime, or rather 3 months later, Caroline Oates' father, he's in his 70s, he passes away and he dies. One of these things that happens, there's a certain amount of grief, you take it in your stride. The family continue to entertain the elderly and the school children here in Gestingthorpe, and then they go on holiday after Christmas to Madeira. There's an outbreak of typhoid, and husband William gets ill and he dies. There is his grave, his cemetery, and the next photograph is his grave. So Caroline is 41 years old. She has no mother, no father, no grandmother, no brothers, no husband. She has a significant income, but she's a widow, and she will remain a widow for the next 41 years. And she has 4 children at what you might call the trying age. Lillian 18, Lawrence 16, Violet 13, and Brian, who's 11. And Lawrence and the family. And there's Lillian, looking, blossoming, and I would think very appealing to any young suitor who might meet her. We'll have the break, Alice, in about 5 minutes or so, if you want to start boiling or pouring, whatever. Caroline has an income. She inherits her husband's £120,000. She has an income of about £5,000 a year. That's a huge amount of money in those times. She keeps an account book, and in it there are something like 6,500 entries from 1896 to about 1915. I'm just going to select a few because they're of particular interest. Runnacles, the builder, that must be work on Gestingthorpe Hall. Finch, a lovely local name. Ward, beer, that's Ward's Brewery from Foxearth. And Elizabeth Rayner, another good local name. On the next page, Colne Valley Railway. We have Nice, the blacksmith, £2, 18 shillings and 4pence. English, they ran Bulmer Brickyard at the time. And Oscar Minchin, who is her butler and retainer, his quarterly wages are £7. The House of Mercy, she makes a donation for washing of £1, 2 shillings and 5pence. What is the House of Mercy? Some of you from Great Maplestead will be aware of it. Yeah. It was a home, and I hate the expression, forgive me, in Victorian times, for fallen women. More to the point, fallen girls who had become pregnant, and I think it allowed them, and I stand to be corrected, to escape from the scrutiny and the criticism of the world while they got their lives back together again. The Eton College account, £73. Blomfield Jackson, that's architectural work on Gestingthorpe Hall, £64. And then on the next one, Madame Amélie. She was the, I don't know who the most famous dress fashion designer is today. Some of the ladies might want to tell me. Well, it might have been Harvey Nicks or something, I don't know. She was, whatever it was, she was that. Rippingale, a nice local name. Brian, flannel trousers, 9 shillings and 3pence. Socks, 9 shillings and 2pence. tithes 3 shillings and 10 pence. To put it into perspective, that is when a farm worker's wage was about 9 shillings a week. Mrs. Surridge for washing, subs to the cricket club, £1. Well done, Mrs. Oates, you've got your priorities right. Lillian's hat, £1, 9 shillings and 9 pence. And knickerbockers and stays, £1, 7 shillings and 5 pence. And so, photos of the grave in Madeira, £3. Lillian's bicycle, £18, 18 shillings. Violet's bicycle, the same price. Crepe for the same, 7 shillings and 6 pence. And so we get this glimpse into the life of a wealthy, exceptionally wealthy Victorian Edwardian lady. And this is particularly interesting for the Sudbury area because there are 2 other very wealthy widows who died in the area. One from Acton, whose name was Elizabeth Bryan. She died about 1430, but she left all her household accounts, and they make interesting reading. The other, and you can get a card if you get this right, was the lady who owned Sudbury in about 1330, and you can give a card to my sister, Jackie. And where do you see a picture of Elizabeth Burr today?
Melford Hall.
What's that?
Melford Hall.
Where?
Melford Hall.
Well, you might do. You also see it on the old black boy, which has been renamed the Lady Elizabeth. So that is why the black boy is now called the Lady Elizabeth. And their 3, the collective effect of their 3 incomes, how they spend their money, how they live their lives, could become a fascinating sort of research for anybody interested in the role of women in the last century and previous century. She begins to spend money on things that she loves, art, crafts and quality. The stained glass window there, which cost about £150, and also the even better stained glass window at the back on the left-hand side, which commemorates her late brother-in-law Frank or Francis, in which you can see something like 27 birds. I'll keep on talking until the wine is ready. That is, the wine's okay. Right. Well, this is one of the most stunning and wonderful glimpses of stained glass you can ever have. After it had been put up, the Queen Victoria's Jubilee was about to be celebrated. In London, it was celebrated on the 22nd of June, but Reverend Bromwich had been invited by Mrs. Oates to witness it from her flat in London, to witness the entire procession of thousands of soldiers and people from around the empire and others who were coming from further afield. It was a most extraordinary cavalcade that went past their house. He comes back to the committee here and says, would you mind if Gestingthorpe didn't hold its Jubilee celebration on June the 22nd, but held it on June the 23rd? How many of you here know the Archers theme tune? Could you join me with the Archers theme tune? Right, well done, that's perfect. If you want to find out what happens next, tune in after the interval when Lillian also springs a surprise. Let's have the wine. Thank you. Two. Three, two. That's perfect, thank you very much. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Charles and Alice, for organising the refreshments. They don't want embarrassing, but you really do deserve a round of applause. So let's go. And Stephanie and Peter, another round of applause, so we include everybody. Thank you. So here we are at the Diamond Jubilee, somewhere even in Mansions, as we'll show a map of that in a moment, is Mrs. Oates and Mr. Bromwich watching this whole cavalcade go by. But in Gestingthorpe, they have this big decision as to, make sure this is working. Here we are. And they do delay it till June the 23rd, despite the concerns or grumbles of Farmer Bear from Nether Hall, who was rather opposed to the idea. They give a dinner to 82 people, and they raise funds to do that, and 14 people who are not well enough to leave their homes are sent a dinner. And with it, we see some of the community spirit that existed in Gestingthorpe at the time. Here's a map of London, and Mrs. Oates' flat, she has a flat in London, it costs her £54, I think, every 6 months, and it is here, close to Victoria Road, Evelyn Mansions, Carlisle Place, and as you can see, in the very heart of theatre land, parkland, all the things that she enjoys doing, art galleries, Albert Hall, Queen's Hall, and concerts. Photograph of Evelyn Mansions as it was, perhaps, when she lived there, and as it is now, or very close to it. One of the properties is happily on the market at the moment. If you all like to put a lot of money in the pot, I might go and see if I can have a bid, but that's what it looks like on the inside, and that's where she would go. She has the third child, Violet. By the time we get to about 1900, Violet is 18, and she shows a certain amount of artistic talent, and she's actually, I think, a very, very good watercolourist, and she does some lovely watercolours of views around Gestingthorpe. For those of you who know the village, this is going down Nether Hall Hill on the road to Bosh and Walter, where Wilfred Teverson used to live. This is, we'll just go back to that, this is Church Cottage, Terry, where you live, and it's a stunningly good painting, isn't it? I mean, you sort of think, had she not been Mrs. Oates' daughter, with privilege, she might have been able to carve a role for herself as a watercolourist. And the privilege perhaps gave her an opportunity, but might have hindered her as well. And these are hill farm cottages, looking a little unkempt because the village farming was beginning to enter a depressed time in the late 1890s. As we get to 1900 and we look at the accounts book, we spot a pivotal name for Gestingthorpe History Group, Harry Fransman. And you will wonder who Harry Fransman is. He lived in London, and he must have been recruited to the Oates staff while he was down there as a baker in Putney, but he's recruited by the Oateses. They must have paid for his fare to come up to Gestingthorpe. That is his wages, and there is a lovely story attached to Harry that we know about entirely because of the Gestingthorpe History website, which Andy Craig runs, who's right in front of me. Harry comes to the hall as a servant, but while he's there, probably coming to church here, he catches the eye, and of course they would all have been frog-marked down to church in those days. He catches the eye of a choir girl whose name is Edith Panner. Harry, after another year, leaves Mrs. Oates. There is Edith here. Andy has provided all the photographs and the information for me. Harry leaves Mrs. Oates, he takes the plunge, and he emigrates to America, or to Canada more specifically, and having got some experience in farming, he takes up the homesteader's offer where you could acquire or be given 160 acres. 6 years later, and I don't know if they met in the interval, he comes back to Gestingthorpe, he comes back to Ardsley House, the Panel family wheelwright, and he proposes to Edith, and she accepts. They get married here in this church, and the choir give her a collection of silver spoons before she leaves England to go back to Canada. It's the most touchingly sweet story, and the thing that really gets me is the 6-year engagement, the 6-year wait. It would be lovely, Andy. Andy is videoing this for the benefit of the panel descendants, the Friendsman descendants in Canada. If you can see me, it'd be lovely to know if Harry came back and visited Edith during those 6 years. He would, of course, been hard at work developing his farm. In the interval, Reverend Bromwich, or I think probably Mrs. Oates herself, has spotted the neglected state of the wooden louvres here. She's spotted how neglected the pinnacles are, and she gives £150 to get the belfry restored and uprated. And while the scaffolding is up, other members of the parish, and always remember there are other members of the parish contributing as well, make sure that the pinnacles are repointed and kept in good condition. 1901, the Boer War has broken out, and my little gadget's being a bit naughty tonight. Right, go back once more. The Boer War has broken out, and oh my goodness. I put a new battery in at half time. Right. Lawrence, who has struggled to pass any exam. He's probably dyslexic, he's certainly dyslexic. He struggles to pass any exam. Finally, the Boer War, in a way, comes to his rescue. He's able to get into the army, the Inniskilling Dragoons. He goes out to South Africa with a small platoon of soldiers. He's surrounded by about 120 Boers who say, does he want to surrender? He answers back, we've come here to fight, not to surrender. He carries on fighting, he gets wounded in the leg. One leg thereafter will always be a bit shorter than the other. Remember that when he walks 800 miles to the South Pole. And the Boers are so convinced that he must have a huge amount of soldiers with him that they actually retreat. Following his injury, he comes back to Gestingthorpe. That middle picture is determined not to be shown. Here we are. He comes back to Gestingthorpe. It's his 21st birthday, and Mrs. Oates lays on the most extraordinary celebration. A grand fete records that great oracle of information, the Helster Times, was accompanied by a brass band, steam roundabout, swings, coconut shies, etc. To this jamboree, all of the village's 100 or so school children were invited to tea, whilst no less than 281 Gestingthorpe residents sat down in the hall, barn and cart lodge to an excellent dinner. After dinner, all proceeded to the hall grounds to present an address of welcome to Lieutenant Oates as the young squire. This is an extraordinary gesture of hospitality, of benevolence on Mrs. Oates's behalf. And you sort of wonder, in a way, why she did it. Was it relief at having Lawrence back? Was it just flamboyant northern generosity? I say that because 3/4 of my ancestors come from the north of England as well. Was she trying to make her mark on the village? And we just asked the question, she's invited effectively the whole of the parish for dinner at her cart lodge. She's fed them all, steam jamboree, games, everything for everybody. How much of the village did she own? Go back to 1869. Is it all the village? Half the village? A quarter of the village? It's actually just 15%. But she is here with her benevolence, the squireen, the lady of the village. The bells are restored, some of them at her expense, some of them at other people's expense, to celebrate the return of Captain Oates from the Boer War. He enjoys, as all young men do, adapting new technology, a motorbike, Caroline records what it costs, a yacht, which we just spotted. Here's a number of accounts from 1904. I'm just going to dip in and choose a few that I looked at this afternoon, rather than keep looking at too many slides. She purchases a number of things around the village. The brickfields for £600, Ashley Cottage for 440, Pound Farm and Tucklands, Brickfields Corner. She spends 13 shillings on strawberry plants, £1 6 shillings on the pantry boy's suit, £5 18 and sixpence to Mr. Roos of Long Melford. The butcher's shop was there until a couple of years ago. Beef for Christmas presents. Laurie's motorbike was £45. Rooms for the Jubilee procession, £45. She takes golf lessons at Newton Green, 11 shillings and ninepence. She loves going to the theatre. She goes to His Majesty's. She sees at the Garrick The Merchant of Venice and pays £1, 2 shillings and sixpence. And I'm told that Adina and Patsy of Absolutely Fabulous would be delighted to know that on November the 1st, 1905, she goes to Harvey Nicks and spends £8, 8 shillings on clothes. She then goes and gets a gold bangle and a mink muff from the Army and Navy stores. And when Lillian marries, she spends £3, 8 shillings and a penny on champagne and 5 shillings and 5pence on the bride's cake. More intriguingly, and this does intrigue me, she subscribes to the anti-suffragette movement. That really comes as a surprise. 87,000 women signed a petition opposing women being able to vote, and it was headed by 30 peeresses. Their logic was that if men want to dirty their fingers and play silly, bickering, catty, vindictive little games of politics, leave it to men. We women are above that sort of childish behaviour. I think that's what their logic was. She's also subscribes to the Selborne Society, Natural History, the Yorkshire Parish History Society, the Yorkshire Archaeological Society, Essex Archaeological Society, well done, so am I, the Essex Field Club, and she gives donations to a whole wide range of things like the Gestingthorpe Poor, £5, Bird Sanctuary, the Naples Society, Mission to Seamen, the Lifeboat Fund, and always the Anti-Vivisection Society. She is absolutely opposed to experiments on animals. As we mentioned, £150 for the belfry. In 1908 or 9, she is able to repair the rood screen here. They find some of the medieval parts of it when they're restoring the church. That was another £150 she contributed. Later on, we will come on to the institute that she builds, where Nick lives today. That cost her £357. And it is an utterly fascinating, riveting thing to go through some of those 6,500 entries. I'm not going to do many more of them, otherwise we'll be here forever. Lawrence's allowance, £125. Lawrence usually seemed to get a bigger allowance than any of his sisters or other brother. Her love of the theatre, some of the theatres she visited, St James, that's Lily Langtry, the Imperial Theatre in London, and she also pays for the publication of this book, Alfred Patchett's History of Gestingthorpe. If ever she did anything wonderful, and it didn't cost her a lot of money in relative terms, about £6, this is it, Mrs. Oates. This is why I admire you, because this is the book that is the foundation stone of Gestingthorpe's history, and we have all dwelt and learnt from it. And 4 years ago, an extraordinary thing happened. On the antepenultimate page, there is a brief mention that at the Moat Farm there used to be a large picture called the Gestingthorpe Choir, and the names of the people in that orchestra are listed beneath. Lowe, Gobbold, Elliston, the Squire, Hale, Wendy. During the lockdown, an artist, a most professional art expert, Philip Mould, started doing some podcasts to entertain people in the lockdown. And Andy Craig, chairman of the group, organiser of the website, was watching one of these podcasts when Philip Mould, with all of his expertise, the greatest art authority, or one of them in England today, showed a picture. It was this one, and he said, "My considered opinion is that this absolutely must have been painted in America." Andy saw this, emailed him, because the names were written above the characters, and said, "Hang on, this picture was painted in Gestingthorpe." Andy, it was an incredible thing. You deserve like about 25,000 rounds of applause. It was a super thing. Let's just give him one, because it got in the Telegraph, it got in other newspapers, and without Mrs. Oates, we would not have known this. And if you want to learn more about the artist, whose name was Robert Cardinal, at the back of the church, there's a picture of Moses and Aaron. They look a bit gloomy and foreboding from here, but he was a local-ish artist who earned his living in the 1720s and came to Gestingthorpe. And that's the squire who owned Gestingthorpe Hall at the time, and the Walker family were his descendants. Mrs. Oates installs this extraordinarily endearing and attractive window of the crests of all the previous owners of Gestingthorpe Hall, the absolute epitome of a William Morris device. There she is, or not there she is, there is the rood screen she repairs, there is her writing. Husband William had photographed all the repairs that were done, and she wrote on the back of all the photographs what it was that he was photographing. By now, Lillian is approaching the age of 30. She's still single. Singing was a necessary social accoutrement then. After a dinner party or anything, the unmarried lady, we all remember this from Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, would sing. And Mrs. Oates hires a professional singer called Frederick Ranelagh to help her assist her eldest daughter's voice. What happens? Frederick Ranelagh, aged about 35, and Lillian fall in love. Frederick goes to Mrs. Oates and asks if he can marry Lillian. She says, "How much do you earn?" And I want everybody to join in with this, because it's passed down into Gestingthorpe folklore. Imagine you're Mrs. Oates, imagine you're horrified by what Frederick Ranelagh earns, and I want you all to reply, "But Lillian spends that much on hats each year." Thank you. I got you to join in, because everyone who's heard talks like this before, this is one of the oft-quoted quotes that comes out. You could have another, we won't do it, you could have another Archer's break there, couldn't you? But she allows them to get married. Of course, she has to support them in the future. Ranelagh is an interesting person. He's on Wikipedia. He's a very good opera singer. He appears at the Royal Albert Hall, at the proms, and is very capable and expert at what he does. And when the organ is installed in about 1909, 1910, there is a recital here, 1910, and he sings some songs to entertain. They also have an expert organist from Westminster Abbey, and clearly Mrs. Oates is using her contacts to ensure that these people come to Gestingthorpe. Year by year, she pays a gardener to make sure that the grave is tended in Madeira. And as we go from the year 1909 to 1910, I feel sometimes that I'm a bit nosy prying into her account books, but they're in Essex Record Office. It was the gift of the Oates family that they should go there. We can see what she spent, £3,219, what her income is, sort of 5,000, what she's been giving to Lawrence, 835, Brian coming in a poor second at 250. It's not always as unequal as that. The following year, she buys a farm for Brian, and that sort of readdresses the scales a little bit. And Gestingthorpe bell ringers, 10 shillings. I think that may have been to celebrate Lillian's wedding, which intriguingly took place in London, and that fascinates me. Beverley is not allowed to answer this question, nor are the church wardens. In 1910, June 1910, she goes to this church, which is... Joe, I think you've won yourself another card. Have you got any cards there, Jackie? Pepmarsh Church. Do you know why she went there? That's a totally unfair question. She goes there... Anybody know why she went there? In those days, yeah. She goes there because Brian, her younger son, marries the daughter of the rector of Pebmarsh. That is at the end of June, or end of May, or early June. And the following day, Lawrence, who we know as Captain Oates, goes back down to London, where he has been busy helping prepare the stores for the Terra Nova, which is going to be the ship that takes Scott's expedition to Antarctica. I'm conscious that time is marching on and that it's not over hot in here, so during the interval I skimmed some slides out. Just to recap, Scott had gone to Antarctica in 1903 and got within about 550 miles of the pole. In 1909, Shackleton had got within about 110 miles of the South Pole, and in 1910, Scott invites contributions, fundraising, to launch another expedition to be the first people to get to the South Pole. He struggles to raise all the funds. Captain Oates' sleeping bag has to be sponsored, I think, by Trafalgar School. The sledges are sponsored by other people. Heinz sponsored the baked beans, Coleman's the mustard. It's a bit of a lame joke. If Richard Branson had been alive, it would now be known as Virgin South Pole. Oates is in control of the horses. That is his expertise as an ex-cavalry officer. He still is a cavalry officer on leave from the army. After they leave Lyttelton in New Zealand, the ship is hit by a terrible storm. It very nearly sinks. They have to bail the water out by hand with buckets because initially the pumps which are pumping the water out get clogged up with coal dust, and the second in command, Teddy Evans, remarks that Oates was on his feet for nearly 2 whole days, standing up, trying to keep the horses standing up so they didn't drown. One of the dogs, a husky, its chain breaks, it is washed overboard, and then as the ship tilts that way, it is washed back on board again and is saved. Eventually, the storm abates and they reach the Antarctic ice shelf, where they are trapped in ice on Christmas Day. They celebrate Christmas Day. Oates sings "The Fly on the Turnip," which I think was probably a bit of a ribald song of the time, waiting for the Antarctic summer to release the ship, and that bird is a skua and the penguins. Eventually it is released and they're able to get down to where they build their base camp. They spend the next couple of months, January building base camp, February and March
laying depots that they will be able to use the following year when they're making the assault on the pole. As they are returning and they go to about a certain position south, as they're returning, inadvertently, one night, some members of the party camp not on land but on ice. During the night, the ice begins to break up and they realise they are on floating ice floes. Oates and others have to try to jump the horses from one ice floe to another, back to dry land, safe land, while there are killer whales in the water around them. After all this adventure, you wonder why they want to go any further, but of course they do. Just an expertly produced map. Those of you who laugh are doing very, very well. That's what you're meant to do. There's Cape Evans, their winter base, Hut Point, where they sometimes camp. This is where they go down and lay depots in the winter of 1911. They had originally planned to go another 11 miles further south. Scott takes the best decision on the day when they get there and they turn round. It is a very tumultuous decision to have taken, because a year later, Scott, Bowers and Wilson will perish just 11 miles short of that one-ton depot camp. Just to, have I already said how many miles it is from base camp to the South Pole? Right, how many more cards have we got left? How many miles is it?
106.
Who said 800 at the back? Right, a card for Alan Burbage. And what altitude is the South Pole? Any advance on 10,000? I think Alan's got himself 2 cards. I think it's just a fraction short of 10,000. It's interesting. You tend to think of it all somehow being flat. But of course there's huge ridges and ravines to get through first. And that is the most southern point Scott had got to on his first attempt on the pole. During the Antarctic winter, that is basically May, June, July, August of 1911, Scott, Oates and his companions are living in a hut which is roughly the size of the nave of the church here. And there are 30 men sleeping, doing experiments, eating, washing, with laboratories in about this sort of size. Why am I showing a picture of Gestingthorpe and of Foundry House and Foundry Corner? The answer is that 3 or 4 years before, Mrs. Oates had bought Foundry House and the Pound Farm, and she wanted to build this wall. It is the mother of all walls. I think if she'd done much more building, Hadrian would have had an inferiority complex. It is the mother of all walls. But the council object, and a whole legal case begins to develop. On the 29th of April 1911, Oates, Scott, in this small hut, safely at base camp, Mr. Braithwaite of Friar Street, Sudbury, now Bates, Wells and Braithwaite, firm still there, he writes to her and says, my opinion is that the outlook is very unfavourable if you persist in saying that is the line. And a few weeks later, I dare not advise you to build a wall. That's the first one. Oates, meanwhile, at base camp, looking after the ponies in the stables built on the back of the main hut. Here the men are. It's nice and cosy in the main hut, celebrating Scott's birthday. Here they are in the bunks. It must have been very, very tense at time, all living together in such crowded conditions. But anyway, there is Oates and his team of friends around him. They called it the Tenements, and their motto was "Down with science and the fair sex." I don't know quite why they added the extra bit to it, but anyway, there we are. They're the Tenements. Back here in England, in Gestingthorpe, on August the 8th, Mrs. Oates erects these hurdles. If you're from Gestingthorpe and you're trying to work out where you're going, you go past Foundry House, on the road to Little Yeldon, you go along that wonderful road, the wonderful wall we've just looked at, and the hurdles are erected, I think, to the point, there is Kemp's cottage, and the wall then goes along there. 21st of October, Mr. Braithwaite writes to Mrs. Oates. Again, it's cautionary, but they need to get the memories of the oldest people in the village. By this time, in the Antarctic, Scott and his team, and initially there's 15 or 20 of them, have set off from base camp. They've got to Hut Point. They're going down towards the South Pole. They seek the opinion of King's Counsel, a man named Mackenzie, and he writes back on November the 11th. And that date's important because the Polar Party are heading south, and he reports that 2 old men, natives of the place, George Chinnery, 84, and Samuel Felton, 69. That doesn't sound that old to me. Never remember that bit of land being used as a passage for beasts or for vehicles. Again, Mr. Braithwaite points out that if only she will compromise by 5.5 feet, then there won't be a problem. She wants her land. She says she has a duty to protect her land. Those are her words. A duty to who? To her son, who is out in Antarctica and who will one day inherit. That's how I imagined. Those are the hurdles again. By the time we reach January the 12th, we have a letter from Mr. Braithwaite to Mrs. Oates. Before that happens, the Polar Party heading south get to Christmas Day. By Christmas Day, Scott has sent a good many of the expedition members back, leaving cairns and depots for them as they return. On Christmas Day, Crean falls down a crevasse. They have to haul him out. Lashley and Petty Officer Evans haul him out, and a few days later, early January, Scott takes the decision as how many people will go with him to the South Pole. Originally it was going to be a party of 4, but he extends it to 5, and as we know, includes Captain Oates. January the 20th, Mr. Andrews, for the council, and he is a descendant of the Robert Andrews in the Gainsborough painting, has been to see Mr. Braithwaite. 3 days before that, in Antarctica, Oates, Wilson, Scott, Bowers and Evans reach the South Pole and discover they are not the first people to be there. Amundsen has beaten them to it, and the looks of disappointment and of disconsolation on their faces tell a better story than I ever can. In the meantime, the hurdles are still there. Mr. Andrews for the council says they must be moved by February the 9th, otherwise they would have been there for 6 months and proved a right to be so. There's that letter of the 20th of January. There is all the elements of a Greek tragedy playing out here. because we know what happens to Captain Oates. And his mother, unaware of all this, is tenaciously fighting her corner. The Polar Party are now heading back. They're heading back those 800 miles to get back to safety. On the 30th of January, she receives another letter from Mr. Braithwaite. That is the day that Evans, the sailor, the biggest, strongest member of the party, dislodges 2 fingernails, and his decline begins to set on from that day. The hurdles are still there. On the 8th of February, Braithwaite writes to her again and says that he's had communication from Mr. Andrews on behalf of the council. They are going to just move them a few inches in a civilised way because they're still looking for a compromise. That's the afternoon, extraordinarily, that Scott, the scientist, devotes a couple of hours in Antarctica to geologising, and they pick up specimens and samples that they haul back with them until they are finally overcome. They are pulling the sledges north now, away from the South Pole. Temperatures are dropping. On the 21st, 29th, a meeting is held of the council, which is the Belsham Rural District Council, that they formally accept Mrs. Oates's position and they back down. And at this point, we've reached February the 29th. In Antarctica, Evans has already died, and the remaining 4 are struggling on. February the 27th, Scott writes, desperately cold last night, -33. Tuesday the 28th, the date of that council letter. Thermometer went below -40. It was desperately cold for us. Started marching in -32, slight northwesterly breeze. Many cold feet this morning. It only gets worse. Wednesday the 7th of March, a little worse I fear. One of Oates's feet is very bad this morning. He is wonderfully brave. We talk of what we will do when we get home. March the 12th, we did 6.9 miles yesterday, under the average we need. Oates not pulling much now, with hands as well as feet, pretty useless. The surface remains awful, the cold intense, and our physical condition is running down. God help us. Not a breath of favourable wind for more than a week, and apparently liable to head into winds at any time. There was still a tiny chance, possibly in their minds, that Cherry Garrard might just have appeared across the horizon with a sledge and a relief dogs to whisk them home. We have one of Cherry Garrard's relatives in the audience tonight, and it is wonderful that you have come here. Thank you. It's wonderful you've come. Thank you. And they continue desperately to plod on. Eventually, Oates can stand it no longer. And Scott writes, and I turn to the book, those famous words he wrote on March the 16th. March the 16th or 17th, lost track of dates, but think the last correct. Tragedy all along the line. At lunch the day before yesterday, poor Titus Oates said he couldn't go on. He proposed we should leave him in his sleeping bag. That we could not do, and induced him to come on the afternoon march. In spite of its awful nature for him, he struggled on, and we did a few more miles. At night he was worse, and we knew the end had come. Should this be found, I want these facts recorded. Oates's last thoughts were of his mother, but immediately before he took pride in thinking that his regiment would be pleased with the bold way in which he met his death. We can testify to his bravery. He went out into the blizzard. He said, "I'm just going outside and maybe some time." We know that poor Oates was walking to his death. It was an act of a brave man and an English gentleman. And the extraordinary thing is, however many times I give the talk, or talks related to it, I can never repress a slight lump in my throat. And as I read through the extracts of January and February, every time I think, maybe this time they will pull through. Maybe things will change. Even though we know how it ends, I always think Scott's writing is so compelling and so absorbing, you really feel you're there with them. That's Oates going out into the blizzard with his socks on. He can no longer endure the pain of putting on his boots. Following Oates's death, Mrs. Oates is in Gestingthorpe and London, completely unaware of what has happened. We have to pinch ourselves and remember there's no mobile phone, there's no satellite, there's no 24-hour-a-day news. She has every expectation that she'll be seeing him the following year. This is her accounts book from December 1912. Oates has now been dead for 9 months, but on the 13th she sends a cable to Laurie, in other words a cable to New Zealand, probably something like, "Welcome home, looking forward to seeing you when you get back." Logically, Oates would get to New Zealand in about February 1913, the end of the Antarctic summer, but she wants to make sure there's something nice for him to receive when he gets to New Zealand. In the same year, she has an artist called Lance Calkin. She commissions a portrait of her late husband, other members of the Oates family, and also herself, and her own portrait costs £220. Some of those Oates portraits are in the Oates Gilbert White Museum at Selborne. I don't think hers is. That's a painting of Edward VII that Lance Calkin did. He's clearly the society artist at the time. As we enter 1913, her expectations are increasing. Logically, the Terra Nova with Oates on board will reach New Zealand in early February. All being well, he can get a ship to England and he'll be back with her by March or early April. You can imagine her here in the gardens planning what they're going to do. Dinner parties she might organise where Lawrence can talk about his adventures to the local gentry, the local squirearchy, the Burkes, the Barnardistons, the Hyde Parkers. Maybe after the 21st birthday, she's planning something enormous, another village jubilee, another village fair or fete. We don't know, but you can imagine all these thoughts going through her mind as we enter January. 3 months, 2 months, I'll be seeing him in a few weeks' time. We see the expenses, the Roos family, beef for the men. She supports the restoration of the baptistery in Siena, her love of architecture. She's still expecting Lawrence to come home. Nice the blacksmith, Pannell the carpenter, Mr. Braithwaite's fee, that wasn't the big one, that was another one. The Anti-Suffragette League, 10 shillings. Income tax, £30, 2 shillings and twopence. Did he even have it then? And then she's in London. The Terra Nova reaches New Zealand. A telegram is sent to the War Office. A telegram is sent from there to Gestingthorpe Post Office. The postboy goes up to Gestingthorpe Hall with the telegram warning Mrs. Oates of her son's death. She's not there. She's in London. The next day, elder daughter Lillian, who married Frederick Ranelagh, is walking down the street when she sees a big newspaper placard, Polar Party lost, all died. It falls to Lillian to break the news to her mother. 3 days later, there is an enormous funeral service of remembrance and respect in St Paul's Cathedral, which Mrs Oates attends. There's another one here where a distant relative attends as well. And then she goes back to one of the things that always gives her sustenance, her account book. It's her daily ledger. And we can see she hears the news, I think, on the 10th. On the 15th, Violet, for telegrams, £10 to all the relatives and people she needs to tell about the loss of her son. A cable to the Terra Nova, 18 shillings and sixpence. And locally, a beloved Gestingthorpe resident, John Hasler, his grandfather, for thatching. Look at those writing. There's not a quiver of the pen. There's not a teardrop. It's that firm, strong writing. You see the stoicism, the indomitability of that Victorian Edwardian spirit. The Terra Nova eventually comes back to England, and here we see a different side of Mrs Oates. We see the Laura Koonsberg, the Jeremy Paxman, the investigative journalist side of her. She wants to know what's gone wrong. How is it that Amuliston got to the South Pole and got back safely? Why has her son died a death? She goes down to the Terra Nova. She pays some of these, just can't easily spot them. Take my word for it. She gives funds to some of the crew for beer and refreshments. She makes payments to some of the others, and using what today would be journalistic skills, begins to build up a picture of events and planning and resources that might not have been as good as they can be. In early July, she is invited with Captain Scott's widow, with Miss Bertie Bowers' mother, with Taff Evans' widow, and with Edward Wilson's widow, to Buckingham Palace to meet the King. She declines. That is an extraordinary thing to do. That's a devastating thing to do. It's, I say compare it with John Lennon, it is an extraordinary thing to do. She doesn't go, the second in command, Teddy Evans, goes in her place. She clearly feels unsettled and unhappy about the way the expedition has been conducted. Locally, she's contributing to the construction and the installation of Gainsborough's statue. She donates £2, 10 shillings to it. She becomes a member of Newton Green Golf Club. That says something about her personality. She's grieving, but she's still carrying on. She's still doing things. And here, in her book, we see the payments that are made in November when the brass plaque on the side of the wall there is unveiled. It's unveiled by General Allenby, clearly a high-ranking British officer, after whom a bridge is named in Palestine, the Allenby Bridge, between today's Israel and Jordan. We see here she hires a waiter, £2 from Melford, to entertain all the people. The church is full, the Inniskilling Dragoons come, members of the Polo Party come, second in command, Teddy Evans, comes for the unveiling. It is a very significant event. There are extra payments for groceries, bell ringers for the day, £1.16, to ensure that everything is conducted as well as possible. And there is the plaque. Second in command, Evans, who comes here, becomes a friend of hers. He is so unwell, he has to be pulled back for half the journey from the South Pole by Crean and Lashley. Luckily, he survives and recovers, and as I say, comes here. And Mrs Oates meets and entertains other members of the Polo Party here. Eventually, she is able to build her wall. I don't think there's almost an element of bittersweetness about it. I don't think I will ever look at that wall again without thinking about Captain Oates and how she was fighting for it when he was fighting for her life. She turns to the one thing above everything that she seems to love more than everything: building and architecture. Had she been born in 1965 or 75, you could see her today with high-vis jacket on, yellow hat, going around building estates as an architect, running an architect's practice. Her expertise is outstanding. She adds this entire wing onto Gestingthorpe Hall, which she turns into a library and to a chapel. She leaves her initials there, just like her husband's initials. She pays for the building of the Lichgate. If ever there was a small building that sums up quality and craft, look at that lovely carving and all the wooden pegs that hold the timber together, it would be that Lichgate. And that was opened in 1915, and here is the Institute, which you pays 350 or 80 odd pounds to become a village reading room and a social centre. As we enter 1914 and 1915, she becomes not one grieving mother, but one of the tens and then hundreds of thousands of grieving mothers. She makes numerous small but meaningful payments: the Devon Regiment, Princess Mary, National Refugees, Queen's Bays, Inniskilling Dragoons, Belgians, they must be refugees at Sudbury, Bank of England, War Loan, £924, she doubles that up, Women's Mission, YMCA Mission, Women's League Service, Bramwell Booth for Belgians. Doing her bit, she sets off organising the knitting of 100 odd costumes or blankets, and her war expenditure continues, dwarfed only by the huge donation she makes to the Oates Memorial Fund of £1,500, and then she makes another one which is set up by the Inniskilling Dragoons. She remains in Gestingthorpe. She's alone now. She has no son. She has Brian, Lillian and Violet. Violet continues living with her to the end of her life. She is pictured entertaining military people on the lawn at Gestingthorpe Hall during the Second World War. She continues to expand the estate. She buys what we know as pump yard cottages in 1919. There they are. And you wonder, why is she expanding the estate? Who is she doing this for, now that Lawrence has died? Here she is in her later days. She always wears black. She sleeps in Lawrence's bedroom. She carries one of his military epithets, which is the insignia on your shoulder, always in her handbag. This is her bedroom. And life perhaps begins to change for her a little bit. Her key ally in Gestingthorpe, Reverend Bromwich, who's been such a support and right-hand man, dies in 1917. There's a stained glass window to him. The village raised £230. Everybody contributing for that window there. He was universally respected. He's replaced by a man called Reverend Greening, who may not have been quite so touch your hat and respectful to Mrs. Oates. I don't know, that's a surmise. But he was a very good carpenter, and he made that kneeler, and I think the kneeler there, which is in the chancel. And if you want a blog, Andy, I will send you a photograph, because underneath the bottom of that it says Reverend Greening made me. And I'll send that to you for next week's blog. And if you join the Gestingthorpe History Group, there's no cost or anything, Andy will send you a blog every single Wednesday morning, which is a wonderful thing to do. About a month ago, he put an advert of this talk, and a lady from Yorkshire saw it advertised, and she has come tonight. She's sitting in the audience, and you deserve a round of applause. Time is marching on. I'll preface, I can never quite give this talk without mentioning that in addition to our famous Inniskilling Dragoon hero who suffered great pain in his limbs, never married, and lies in an unmarked grave, there is another one. My personal hero, Henry Cook, born in this village. He lost an arm in a harvesting accident as a boy. He lost another arm in a threshing machine accident, so he had no hands left. Hooks were made to put into stumps. You can see them here. Locally, he was known as Hooky Cook, but he was able, with those facilities, to still do a full day's work, driving a traction engine, carrying sacks, doing hedging, helping the Belsham Water blacksmith. And he is my personal hero. He also lies in an unmarked grave somewhere, very, very coincidentally, just the other side of the Captain Oates plaque, and very, very, almost hauntingly coincidentally, a film was made about him, which was released a fortnight after Captain Oates had walked to his death. It's almost the two lives are in parallel. As Mrs. Oates reaches her 70s, she resists the changes to the manorial rules of property. It's all wound up, and her solicitor says very patiently, "Dear Mrs. Oates, much as we love tradition, we do have to move with the times." There is a wooden board at the back of this church that commemorates the great mass of bell ringing here, rung to commemorate the safe return of Mr. Augustine Courtauld from the Arctic regions. Augustine Courtauld of that famous Courtauld silk factory of Headingham and Braintree that paid for the Courtauld Gallery in London. Augustine had gone towards the North Pole, a meteorologist. He'd been left on his own in a tent, thinking people were going to come and relieve him quickly. They couldn't get there for several months. He had almost run out of food when relief came. I can only imagine that Mrs. Oates patronised those bell ringers to come here and rejoice as she would have done at Augustine's safe return. A picture of her here the year before she died. There is Gestingthorpe Hall, still in its prime and ascendancy. She's right in the middle with, I think, estate staff and other villagers around her. I stand to be corrected. It would be nice to know more. She dies in November 1937. And you think of all the things that she so enthusiastically encouraged to be done in this church, and you look round for a plaque or a memorial. The only one there is a tiny little brass plaque, which I'll show you in a moment, on a seat. More bafflingly, she doesn't want to be buried here. Strict instructions, she's to be cremated in Ipswich, and nobody follow the car. It's utterly, you could lay awake all night and wonder of her rationale. Does she want to be cremated for her soul to escape? Has she fallen out of favour with this church? She used to come here every week and polish the brass plaque. The family still went to church. For whatever reason, she's cremated in Ipswich. And there is a mystery. On one of the pews in the choir stall, her daughters erected this very small little memorial to their mother, their father, their brother, and also Lillian and Frederick's son, their only son, who died in the Second World War in the RAF. I commend and think again Catherine McInnes for the sterling work she did, this brilliant book that looks at the Antarctic expedition from the female's point of view. It's captivating and absorbing. Go out and buy it. And I round up with just a few last comments of, I hope, a balanced view of Mrs. Oates, the Oates family, immensely privileged, how lucky they were to come to a village like Gestingthorpe where they found such a fulfilling role, and how lucky the church in a special was to have the extra things done. One way or another, I think the restoration, the main restoration would have taken place. It's the extra things, the bells, the belfry, the rood screen, those wonderful, wonderful stained glass windows, the lich gate, this bringing of quality architecture, I've repeated it so often, the William Morris element, the arts and crafts, fineness of craftsmanship to Gestingthorpe. I thank her for the accounts books, that's what they look like, which have got so much captivating local history and local references in them, and especially for the £6 that went to pay for Alfred Patchett's cornerstone of Gestingthorpe history. That wonderful stained glass window. Do come back again, look at it in sunlight, see how many birds you can count. It's a very lame joke. If you can't see 10, go to Specsavers. If you see more to 30, also go to Specsavers. And the final photograph, we had the mystery. Why did she decide to be cremated in Ipswich? We don't know. But the one thing we do know, I think, is where, after cremation, her soul actually went, to Madeira and to Antarctica to be with her husband and her son. Before I end, a second reminder that this evening has been hosted by the church wardens and their helpers to try and keep the church as beautiful as it was in Mrs. Oates' time. Donations will be very, very warmly received. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you in advance for supporting the church. Thank you to all those who have organised the evening. Thank you.